policy committee meeting this morning to order. And since we have new members as part of the policy committee, we are going to name a chair for the committee.
I'd like to nominate Ray Gallagher to be chair. Second.
Are you willing to accept that nomination? Okay, I think you have consensus.
All right, great, thank you. So the next item on our agenda is 1.02, approval of our October 26th policy committee meeting.
I'll make a motion for approval. Second.
All those in favor?
And I think you have 2 people signed up for public comment, as well as you had 2 submittals in writing.
Absolutely. So we'll start with the 2 speakers who are present in the room with us this morning. So we'll start with Rebecca Hodgkins.
All right. Good morning. My name is Rebecca Hodgkins. I have 2 children who attend Newmarket Elementary. We found out last summer that FCPS intends to remove bus transportation for 2 neighborhoods in Newmarket, impacting, we've heard from 80 to 120 elementary students. These neighborhoods have had bus transportation for more than 15 years, and there's been no significant improvements to walking conditions aside from completion of a small portion of sidewalk and a couple of new crosswalks. There's been several community meetings. Distance, safety, and lack of childcare options have been discussed as major concerns. The biggest issue, however, is that due to these concerns, most parents will transport their students by car once the buses are no longer available, contributing to an already significant traffic problem on the only road through our town. On a given day, and particularly in cold or inclement weather, school traffic may block our main street for 10 minutes or more prior to school dismissal, and back up traffic more than half a mile, blocking homes, businesses, and most significantly, the fire department. Parents also resort to using a neighborhood road next to the school to drop off and pick up students. It creates traffic and safety issues where students are trying to walk to and from school through that neighborhood. This is all prior to the addition of all these extra students once we remove busing for these 2 other neighborhoods. And the current policy gives no consideration to community impact. So in comparing the FCPS policy to other counties, I found the following. The maximum walking distance for elementary students in Montgomery County is 1 mile. All elementary age students in Carroll County are eligible for bus transportation, and the maximum walking distance for middle and high school students is 1 mile. Howard County, I couldn't find specific distances, but they require that traffic and walking conditions meet a reasonable level of safety, and they make transportation decisions in consultation with multiple agencies, including the police department and other community organizations. So for example, Newmarket is an incorporated town. We have a mayor and a government. They should be part of these decisions, school administrators, etc. In reviewing additional FCPS policies, I was surprised to find that the maximum walking distance to a bus stop is only half a mile, and compared to 1.25 mile walking distance to school. So there are several items I would ask that you consider in reviewing the current transportation policy. Reduce the distances that students are required to walk to under 1 mile for all ages, and less for elementary age students. Provide bus transportation for all elementary students whose school is not contained within their neighborhood. Increase the distance required from the sidewalk or shoulder to traffic from 3 feet to at least 5. Require consultation with the police and fire departments, school administrators, town governments, and the community when making decisions to remove bus transportation. Add undue impact to the community to the list of exceptions in section 441.8 of the policy, and require consideration of the number of roads crossed and the number of students impacted. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Lori Donna. Durrell. Sorry about that.
And actually, that's my daughter, so I'm just here to reiterate what she said and to say that as a grandparent of 2 students who helps out, I would be driving my grandchildren. And there's just no way I would even set the 3rd grader loose to walk to school because, and I welcome you to come to the community and see the way it's arranged, but the expectation right now is that, and I did write an email, that they would go down a hill and then up a hill. They won't do that. If they're set out on their own, they're going to take that back alley that has no sidewalk at all. but it is the shortest, most direct route to get to the school, and it's not a bad walk on a nice day. But the truth of the matter is, if they go down to Main Street, which is the expectation, that they are passing 19 alleys and driveways. And there is parking along the road. So I know cars, and I try to be very careful myself, but you're actually driving over where people walk to get your car to a point where you can see the cars that are coming. So unfortunately, that's a very important safety hazard, as well as the fact that to get to the alley, they would be crossing Old Newmarket Road, which FCPS has said that is not the way that they want students to walk. But unfortunately, that is the way they will walk. They have no chance of taking a bike unless they go through that alley. You can't take a bike on the sidewalks of Main Street. Main Street sidewalks are brick, so they're very uneven. There's things encroaching on both sides. And again, the parking along there, her husband had his car totaled when it was parked along the road. So there's definitely accidents that occur, even though it is a narrow road and low speed limit. There's definite safety hazards. And as I said, as a grandparent, if I'm charged with getting my grandchildren to school, I will be driving them. I will be sitting on Main Street, blocking those businesses that we've tried to encourage to come to Newmarket, and blocking that fire department. Thank you.
Okay, do you want to read the two statements that you submitted for the record?
Certainly. So the first one was submitted by Renju Thakkankari. And it says, good morning. It's been brought to my attention that the policy committee meeting is being planned for transportation. We live in the villages of Urbana currently since we moved 5 years ago. There has been a lot more home and townhomes that have come up, indicating a higher density of students and thereby a need for new elementary schools. When these students end up moving to the middle school, there will be a higher number of students who will need to get to the school, thereby creating more traffic and using personal transportation. I urge the committee to consider the density of students and thereby request for the transportation of bus to middle school to 1.5 miles instead of the current 1.75 miles. My daughter will attend middle school next year, and we hope for a better outcome regarding transportation. Thank you. And the second one was submitted by Brooke Faulkner. And it reads, good afternoon. I'm writing to you today to submit a public comment for the policy committee meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. I'm unable to attend, but would like to share some comments regarding the bus transportation policy. I will try to keep my email brief and hopeful you have been kept abreast of past board of education meetings and correspondence with the community. My household has already lost bus service for Centerville Elementary due to the redistricting. Our household was notified at the beginning of this school year that we would lose bus transportation for UMS, even though we are further away than the mileage allowance. There are a few things I'd like to bring to your attention while you're revisiting this policy. FCPS has the longest mileage parameters within all metropolitan areas of the state of Maryland. Montgomery, Carroll, Howard, Washington, and Anne Arundel all bus elementary school students if they live over 1 mile away. For middle school, Howard and Carroll bus over 1 mile. Montgomery, Washington, and Anne Arundel bus over 1.5 miles. According to the FCPS site, elementary is from 1.25 and middle is 1.75. It's a shame that FCPS is at the bottom of the list for transporting their students. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no more than 10 to 15% of a child's body weight in their backpack. In most cases, you'll find that these kids today are carrying way more than that on their backs and person. Also keep in mind, UMS doesn't allow backpacks, so a lot of children just wear a drawstring bag to school, which can be painful and offer no support. The terrain of our community where bus service is being removed is challenging. We need to take a break, even if we walk just to Centerville from where I live and my household is in tip-top shape. Are we really expecting kids to walk 45 minutes to and from school for a total of an hour and a half a day? I don't even know many people, period, that could do that every day. There's only so much time in a day. This seems extreme on a daily basis. On October 26, 2022, at the Board of Ed meeting, Board President Brad Young detailed his walk with a child in our neighborhood. He explained the steep terrain, unsafe driving practices, and the amount of traffic he encountered, even after school started. He asked for a crosswalk to be added on a particular street, haven't noticed, pretty sure it's not there, as well as ask for additional speed enforcement, and the community hasn't happened. The driving line he observed at UMS is not safe and extremely long. This policy was revised years ago, increasing the mileage by a quarter mile. Brad Young was on the board when this occurred. He noted it was because of a few years in a row of no new movement. That is no longer the case. It is time that you revert back countywide by lessening the distance a quarter mile. This would make our county more in line with other counties in Maryland. Density. If the policy isn't going to be revised countywide, please consider adding a density criteria to the policy. As you know, Frederick County has large community PUDs with large clusters of people who should be eligible for transportation. In more rural areas, adhering to an increased mileage parameter isn't as big a deal and could affect 10 kids. Whereas in Urbana, Linganore, City of Frederick, Oakdale, etc., it could impact thousands. I have attended multiple BOE meetings within the past year to voice my concerns regarding the bus transportation policy. I have sent multiple emails, of which thank you to our BOE for being so responsive. I've also spoken and submitted public comment. I've had conversations with Dr. Paul Lebo, which I appreciate. Thank you to everyone for making the right decision for our families and communities to with this policy. I look forward to seeing a positive outcome for Frederick County families and students. Thank you.
So well done, and I want to say, for the record, you did that in 3 minutes. So the reason being is some people will sign up, some people will submit, and we still have that consistent criteria of 3 minutes. So if that would have been voluminous, we would have highlighted it, but know that when we post our minutes, those public comments will be also uploaded. So well done, well done. So with that, Ms. Gallagher, you want me to start with the first agenda item? And so the first agenda item is policy 441, but you'll see there's no staff recommendation. It's to bring for direction because as Ms. Gallagher read in the one public comment, Mr. Young and the board in October were evaluating this issue. And I know in the budget process, we've had some cost out estimates relative to modifying this. So this is, we recognize this as a very significant policy that has fiscal implications. And it's also, relative to safety and information. So it is a policy a lot of people care about, certainly including us. So I think Mr. Young's intent was to say, as a policy committee, is there information that you feel if you want to explore a modification? Is there information that you feel that Dr. Lebo with the transportation staff would want to research and gather and then come back for a further discussion, starting with the policy committee?
I mean, I think the two most relevant data points are the cost if we decrease elementary distance to 1 mile, and I would say decrease secondary distance to 1.5 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps that's been provided before, I can't recall, but I think those are two of the most relevant data points.
To bring to the policy committee for review, David? Okay,
Yes.
Mr. Bates, thank you.
I have some questions, and I know Dr. Lebo's done this research quite often, so I don't think he'll have any trouble putting that together for us. I had a question about, is it 441.2 E?
Mm-hmm.
How do we go about determining, we've got 6 exceptions there,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of distance. How do we as a system determine if a walking situation fits within one of those 6 exceptions?
So it starts with sorry, let me back up for a second. Our county is divided up by areas for our transportation managers. So every transportation manager has a section of the county, and they are the ones that really oversee that area and get to know that portion of the county, and they're responsible for both the transported and non-transported area. So it is their responsibility to review issues that come up that we're aware of. I will share that what exists today, in most cases, has been a practice for a long time. So there's no need to sort of review if there was a sidewalk today. It's typically a sidewalk that will exist tomorrow. In many cases, there are times when things get added, but I can't think of one, at least since my time, where they've taken the sidewalk away or a walking path. So they don't necessarily relook old walking routes. It's when there's new impact is when they really take a close look at that. I will share that, we've spoken to the board publicly, the 2 years of COVID, we sort of took a hiatus from the normal practice, given all of the other issues, especially about lack of drivers. And so when our managers were out helping drive, that was one of the areas where we said, we've got to pull back. We can't go evaluate changes that have occurred to look at changes to walking routes. We just don't have the manpower to do that right now. And so some of the changes that occurred over that 2-year period, it didn't feel like it was something new to a community, as an example, because in some cases it may have been a change that happened sometime during 2020, right? And we didn't look at it again prior to the start of the 2022 school year. So I didn't want to throw that out, but that was a long answer to say it's part of the transportation manager's responsibility to evaluate their area. We do have routine meetings, or transportation staff meets with state highway, county road crews to look at projects that may exist. For a number of years, there were quite a few grant opportunities that the city and the county took advantage of to add pedestrian safety measures and increase sidewalks. And so as they had those quarterly meetings with the team, they would hear about them, then would go out and evaluate, does this now meet the criteria, or does one of these exceptions?
So I guess my follow-up to that is, if a community, say a community of families came to us and said, we'd like the policy to be looked at by FCPS under, say, Part E, number 2.
So
would we ask our area manager to evaluate that walk?
we would. And for something to be changed from a transport area to a non-transport area, we do have a formalized process where the transportation manager submits it to the transportation director. He reviews, has that conversation with me. I review and approve, and then have a conversation with the superintendent to make sure there's consistency. I do want to say that whatever changes, or if there are any changes to this policy, staff would just ask that it be as clear as it is written. I believe, and staff certainly believes, that the intent of the board that wrote this policy at the time was very clear, and I'm confident in saying that it's consistently applied. And so we're not advocating for not a change. I would throw in there that the clarity is very helpful to ensure consistent practice across the county.
And when we changed this before, it was an 8-month review, lots of public comment. And so, and lots of great information from transportation staff, even the state highway, developing walkways, things like that. So it was a very comprehensive review. So a change is not a short walk. It's a long journey for obvious reasons, because we want to make sure you have all the information that you need relative to making that change.
Is it accurate that we were at 1 mile for elementary, 1.5 for secondary, and then for budget reasons, we changed
Yeah,
the
I think
policy?
that is the history.
I
But you were here.
I was not here when
Yeah.
it was changed, but I'm almost 100% confident in saying that was the distance, and the change was made in like the 2009 timeframe to modify it to 1.75 or 1.25.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see the date and any relevant information around that change.
We can
I
pull
think
that.
what the public commenter said is likely accurate, that I think that was in several years of only maintenance of effort, funding, and it was the recession, but it would be interesting to see.
When we modified it, the rationale that the board used, would that be helpful to bring back to the policy committee? Sure. Okay, so we have some cost-related factors associated with modifying it you'd like for Paul and his team to bring back. Ms. Zimmerman and I will work back as far as getting the archives and the rationale when the board changed it before. Ms. Gallagher?
I mean, I think in terms of the cost, and I know Dean already asked about the impact on, like, how many new buses we would need to add, bus drivers, which of course there's cost, but other considerations for us to make as well. So just thinking about, all of those various impacts that are financial, and what else we would need to purchase and or hire in terms of support if we were to go to the 1 mile.
Okay. So staffing impact. True. All right. And buses. Yeah. Buses and people.
I think this came up in some of our budget
It
discussions.
did, it did. We'll be able to pull that.
Yeah, and for consideration also that we have so many bus drivers we need, and to lump onto that
Mhm.
more, it is a stressor on hiring practices. Couple of questions. Do we currently have bus routes under the current documented numbers? Do we have bus routes that we have evaluated, say, under this policy that don't have sidewalks, they're under the mileage, but we
Yes.
do provide?
Yes, we do have, if they do not have a safe walking route, that aligns with the policy.
And that's very detailed, and that was a very big point of conversation with the board prior to carve out when those exceptions do apply. So I think that's a really strong part of our current policy.
You know, many of our, I don't even want to call them rural schools, just schools that may not sit in a community. Lincoln High School is a good example. There are no walkers to Lincoln High School. There are no safe walking routes to Lincoln High School. Even the Newmarket community, there are many areas that, as the roads lead, are less than 1.75 or 1.25 miles, but there are no sidewalks to get students there. So they do receive transportation services.
So a little bit to another, because I don't really understand how we also do the circumference around, say, a bus stop.
Okay.
So if someone is outside the 1.75 miles and that area receives buses, the other family is inside the 1.75, but it's only a half a mile walk to the bus stop. Can they walk to that bus stop and ride the bus?
They can, there's actually language in the policy that does allow for that with approval of the transportation director. Give me a second, I will refer to it.
So maybe some of this would be helpful if we shared the location of bus stops to parents in these dense neighborhoods.
Well, but I got to caution the board on that because.
But I understand
Right.
the
We have to be
impact
careful
of
with
number of bus
bus
riders.
loads, right? And that's really our concern, but yes, 441.8 discusses when that is.
If the school bus is not filled, no bus stop is added, and the director of transportation has identified a specific existing hardship that would justify allowing the student. So that's the criteria at the very end of the policy.
So is that another plan that your department could consider though? Could consider if we're doing a circumference around a bus stop and then we survey based on our data, this is how many bus drivers that's going to add. I mean, how many bus riders that would add to that. We could offer the opportunity for families to walk their kids to the bus stop versus walking the 1.5 miles. They could walk a half a mile to a bus stop. That makes sense.
No, it does.
I'm just adding that to an evaluation cost-wise. Would that help? And particularly, I'm thinking about our dense communities like Urbana, like what's going out on the west end and Waverly area and things like that, how dense some of those neighborhoods are.
The only, and we will look at that. The only thing that worries me, and I can just use the Urbana example, just because the one commenter, she's been very, very great to deal with and sharing concerns. So I just happen to know the section that there would not be an opportunity for anybody in that section of the village of Urbana to do what you're saying,
Right.
because there are no bus stops.
There isn't one.
Probably within 1.5 miles of their residence, right? So that would be my one concern, is that we would have an inconsistency in being able to offer that. Doesn't mean we shouldn't evaluate. I want to throw that out there off the top of my head, thinking, but I just happen to know, since she had shared that location, that would be my bigger concern in the densely populated areas. There's just not going to be a location that they can walk to that would alleviate that concern. So, but certainly for us, we can pull that pretty easily using our routing software to kind of look to see what the impacts would be versus transported, non-transported, and how far folks get sort of backwards to get routes. So we'll take a look at that.
All right, so we have a lot of homework. And so our next meeting is February 22nd, then you have March 22nd. And so I'm going to look to Dr. Levo to determine, would you like this to come back February 22nd if Dr. Levo and his staff can? Okay. Ms. Zimmerman, you heard that? Okay. Anything else? I don't want to rush through this item. Okay. And certainly as we gather this information, Ms. Gallagher, I'll reach out to you, make sure we're being responsive to all the questions in preparation for February 22nd.
Thank you.
There are very small edits on this that I would recommend with emailing you and the policy.
Oh, yes. So we're not going to make any edits. We're just bringing back information. So what we do is we typically then say, this is kind of the agenda we're building out for the 22nd. And then before we upload it, we do communicate that to the policy committee. See if you want to modify the agenda. Did we hit it right? Do we have enough time? Has something time sensitive come up in the meantime? So thank you, Mr. Bass. But yeah, we would notify. It's just if I had some clarifying questions, I usually focus that to the chair. Is that okay?
Okay. I know this is totally out of, and I don't want to set a precedent here. I wanted to ask Ms. Hodgkins, you recounted quite a bit of data there. If I could just ask you, would you be willing to email that to us? Thank you.
Are you considering traffic impact as well?
Well, like I said, here I started president. But yeah, absolutely. We'll certainly consider that, and I would appreciate you sending us that data.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the next item is policy 319. This is 1.05 on the agenda. And these are kind of what I'd call editorial updates. The administrative management and technical group, sometimes there's new and revised titles in this group. This is your group of employees that are not eligible to be in a union. Okay, just to give a little background, they're not eligible to be an FCTA, FACE, or FCASA by nature of their position. And it's a relatively small group. And so this policy and any updates, it kind of governs their employment conditions. So a couple title changes, and we always provide that through the link within the policy. But for example, with the new chief of staff, that's a new title now, chief legal counsel, because that was modified under Dr. Dyson's plan. Staff attorney is a new position as well, assistant data manager. So with repurposing and reallocation or adding new positions, when they fall in this category, we update that. The second update has to do with, in this policy, it says that any benefits that's negotiated under the FCASA unit, your leadership group, flows to this group. And so they can reference the negotiated agreement, but ones that we've pulled out that we get a lot of questions and they seek a lot of guidance is tuition reimbursement. So recently the board modified the language in the FCASA negotiated agreement regarding tuition reimbursement. So we lifted that out to update it within this policy. So those are the two primary changes to this policy that we would recommend approval.
Can you remind us the changes to the tuition reimbursement for FCASA?
So they're outlined on page 2 for the non-doctoral graduate coursework. And so the flat rate increased to $8,500 in 2024 and $10,000.
Ms. Kennedy, I mean specific, you said part of why we're looking at this policy
Yes.
is to look at tuition reimbursement for AMT because the board negotiated some changes with FCASA, with
Correct.
the union. And I can't recall the increases we offered to FCASA.
Yeah, they're outlined all on page 2.
So those are pulled from.
So everything you see in red was what was approved with FCASA.
It's identical.
It is. Because the first part of the policy, Mr. Bass, indicates it has to be.
So we're kind of applying the Me Too
Yes, very good.
between.
I would say it's very
between the
equivalent to
association.
Me Too, yes.
Yeah, I'm open to considering not applying it directly. I'm open to considering that most of the folks in the AMT designation, are, well, I mean, it varies on the position, right? But in some cases, they will likely make more money in their career or just, I don't know. I'm open to considering not applying the direct increases that the board has offered to FCASA to these non-union positions.
And I will share that how, especially with the doctoral degree, usually superintendents want to encourage individuals in this group because in large part, it's people in senior leadership or cabinet. And it was very much a credential that was valued. So I know under Dr. Dale and Dr. Berge in particular, they wanted to encourage this group in particular to get that degree. So that's some of the rationale.
I mean, I think when we consider both recruitment and retention of our staff at all levels within FCPS, I mean, one of the big benefits has to do with reimbursement and encouraging ongoing professional development in these positions. And so is this comparable to what other systems offer AMT?
Yes, yes. And again, because it's a small group and a lot of people in the group already have that credential, when you look at that, the group of individuals, but some are emerging leaders within a group and don't have that protection of a union. So some people don't want to traverse over to this group. Some people do because they want that promotional opportunity, but some people say, I don't want to lose that because anyone you have in here is an at-will employee. So there's the pros and cons, looking at that. But by law, you have to carve out this separate group to not be in a union because they always have to be eligible to serve on your negotiating team, et cetera, and some other things.
I'll also offer for the record that we're not just competing against other educational systems. We're competing within an industry of which I believe some of our cabinet level staff would be valued members among any number of different companies. And using the example of my company actually offers reimbursement tuition to Harvard, Wharton, and the University of Virginia Business School for their upper level management, because just as Ms. Gallagher said, they encourage their folks to achieve these type of educational opportunities to make them more valuable within their organization and retain them, because that's what we're up against now. I think we're seeing it in the teaching profession. The teachers are leaving the teaching profession because they've shown they have a passion for anything they do, that they can be successful in any number of different roles. And I think we could possibly pay that price in our manager roles if we don't live up to what's going on in the business environment.
Well, and if you look at some of the positions in this unit, you do have like your network security supervisor, a Ted Gardner position. So this also is a cross section of not only the cabinet, but then on that operational side of the house. And we do compete with private sector, especially on that side of the house.
And I don't mean this as an argument that they couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
I understand. What I'm saying is that it's a competition and retention, I believe, situation for us.
I know this is, offered in many school districts. It sounds like the consensus of the policy committee is to continue to offer it.
Now,
I
also,
think I
oh,
struggle.
go ahead.
I think I struggle because in some cases, these are, so not in all cases, which is interesting, the salary range among AMT. So that's an interesting thing. But among, say, a cabinet member who's going for a PhD, I mean, it's among our highest paid employees, and I believe they will get a salary readjustment after, say, they complete the PhD. So then to also offer money for them to get the PhD and a compensation once they have it, I'm not 100% comfortable with it. And Mr. Rose, I definitely appreciate that we're competing with the private sector, but right, I mean, the private sector isn't being funded by the would really be open to us exploring whether this is fully in our best interest as a system.
Well, and I think it comes back to the value of the credential. But I think too, it's important that the language also that came over from the FACASA agreement, and this was important for the board because a doctorate is an investment of money. It's an investment of time. And so on page 2, you'll see that if someone leaves employment, there is that obligation of repayment. And that is new. So that's coming over. And 2, I would share that there's a relatively very small number of individuals in this group that are seeking that doctorate. But certainly if they do, it's always been since I've been here that the superintendent has wanted to encourage that credential and understands the rigor of the work. But certainly I'm going to do whatever you guide me to do as far as if you want some additional information, from this perspective, we can do pause and talk about it again next time.
Can I ask a clarifying question on so it does say, right, folks who voluntarily leave employment with FCPS within 3 years must repay the employer. But what if folks don't voluntarily leave? What if they're terminated? I mean, is that covered in this policy?
So I've only had this example in one particular case when if we want, we've decided we need to part ways with this individual, maybe not meeting the expectation. It's something we usually negotiate as a resolution that a separation of employment does evaluate that factor. Sometimes we might say you have to pay 50% back. Sometimes we might say, let's just part as amicable as possible, and you're not going to appeal that decision because again, it's an at-will employee, and when you're in a leadership position, getting to that level, that's on a case by case and usually evaluated at the superintendent level. I would say that's a real anomaly, but yeah, it's intentional that the voluntary separation. You've elected to leave versus we wanted you to stay or we're terminating you.
At a minimum, I'd like us to consider that if the superintendent were to determine that someone needs to be terminated from their role, that I don't think FCPS should, I think they should have to repay the graduate degree, the graduate credits that we've covered.
And the language for cause.
It could say if they're terminated, because oftentimes, like I said, you can terminate, you can resign, and if you resign, it is a voluntary separation. So that's why it kind of gets into the negotiations, because if we want to terminate you and you say, I want to resign, then you are voluntarily separating, and I think this language does apply. So yeah, we could modify that if.
Does adding that termination language in here add any potential complications to that process or the appeal process? I mean, I think that there might be unintended consequences of adding that language in here and enforcing the repayment. I mean, you said this has only happened one time. And,
Right.
but I'm concerned that there might add some, because when you go through a termination, there's the potential for appeal and all other sort of other things that factor in, that this particular language could, that maybe if it's a case of termination, we want to be able to leave it open enough so that there's
It could create, an obstacle. It could create an obstacle, but not one that certainly couldn't work through. But like I said, when you're in those rare circumstances with somebody in this group, I think you want to give the superintendent as much flexibility to know what a fair resolution and separation looks like.
And is this language pulled from the FACASA
It is.
contract?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
we're going against everything else we're doing in this policy rewrite, where we're pulling it exactly from the
Right.
FACASA.
Right.
If we were to change this particular.
Correct.
I think those are great points. It's just, right, I mean, these positions are separated from FACASA for a reason, right? I mean, that they're the folks negotiating on behalf of the board and the nature of the position. I mean, right, there's a reason they're not in FACASA. So I'm really struggling with this.
I guess my question, again, being new, is that as a policy committee, we're taking action to recommend that this then go to the full board,
Correct.
correct?
Mhm.
So a case can still be made at the full board whether to approve these changes. We're just recommending the changes. Whatever our vote is, we're recommending the changes to the board. A case can be made at the full board.
Yeah.
Whether to.
Well, perfect
approve it.
example
To
is
send it
policy
back to-
117,
Send it back
right?
to us.
We love policy 117 because I think each policy committee member said, we love all the text, but we can't decide on the title. We want to take that decision for the full board. So this is something that staff is recommending, and it is aligned with what the board has told us to do. The board has said in this policy right now, if you change the CASA, this benefit carries over in a Me Too fashion, and we should update the policy. If now you really want to take a different action, I would say that's a significant deviation that the full board should discuss, because I would say that's a significant shift in direction.
I think that's a really good point. I mean,
Because I think for all future policies that we send to the board, it's appropriate to say that we recommended this policy to you by a 2-1 vote.
Yeah.
Two
Mhm.
voted yay and 1 abstained.
Mhm.
And then that person can make the case to the board of why they abstained or why they voted no, and allow the full board to actually weigh in
Correct.
and send it back to us then if they need,
Yep.
there need to be edits.
Yep, and that's often, what can happen. So with that, then is this ready kind of where we are? You didn't have any edits right now, but now our next discussion, you want me to elevate this for the full board for work session?
I had another question on it, and this may also be, this would be an even bigger change, so probably for discussion with the board. But I think there could be a scenario where a board would want to take an even more active role in the collective bargaining. And so I just wonder, in the very last sentence, employees in the AMT group serve as members of the board's collective bargaining resource team, a more, rewording to say may serve or may be selected to serve, I think would be wise. Still would allow the board to utilize this group, but would allow the board to not utilize this group if a future board wanted to go in a different direction.
Well, yeah, and that's why we bring forward the recommendation before you appoint the teams. That's why Dr. Dyson and before that, Dr. Alban would say, here's who I'm thinking for the teams, before then we put that on consent agenda. But if you're saying you might want to look at individuals outside of, the AMT group to represent you, of course, that'd have to be an outside, like a contract kind of situation, because the other people aren't eligible because they're in a union. But yeah.
I don't think that's, in my opinion, I don't think that's a huge change because not all of the employees in the AMT group serve as members of.
Correct.
But some of, but some of the members do, and so adding some language in there to clarify would be a huge deal.
Sure, we can do that.
And so could we do that and still vote to forward this on? to the full board?
Yeah, we can make that modification. I'm trying to just look what page, so, right there, okay. May, I think, David, you said may be selected to serve.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
All right, we can make that edit, and then we'll bring it forth for the full board discussion. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to invite Ms. Duckshaw up for the next one. This is, again, an editorial change, but a result of something that is a little bit of a deviation in Maryland law compared to federal law as it relates to the criteria for investigating sexual harassment claims. So I'll pull your attention to page 3. And if you look at that red footnote, and you'll see that this was a House bill that now has come into Maryland law relative to the standard of when you look at the totality of the circumstances. And so, Michelle, you want to just talk a little bit about the edit from a legal perspective?
Sure. So last legislative session, the Maryland General Assembly passed Senate Bill 450, which added in an additional parameter for the definition of what we believe meets the definition of sexual harassment. So the federal law, the new Title IX regs are still in place, but this new Maryland law adds additional standards. subjects where it's certain conduct that doesn't have to meet the severe and pervasive standard, which is the federal law. Essentially, it's saying if it meets these categories, it inherently is the severe and pervasive. However, in practice, this doesn't change how Julie, Nguyen, and I conduct investigations. It adds additional as to what legally meets the definition. But when Julie and I make recommendations, and Ms. Nguyen and I make recommendations, we look at the totality of the circumstances. Because even if something doesn't meet the definition, we'll still make recommendations of what is appropriate follow-up. So in practice, this won't have a lot of change on how we conduct the investigations. It's just important to note that's additional state level protection under the law.
Because the federal government kind of elevated the standard of, hey, to be sexual harassment, it has to be severe and pervasive, and it elevated the standard. So sometimes when Ms. Dockshaw do an investigation, she'll say that this was inappropriate conduct, but it doesn't meet this new higher definition. So we'll say to the employee, it might not have meant it, but you still shouldn't do this. Maryland has come in to say, we respect this higher federal standard, except when you've made it a condition of employment, a sexual interaction, and now this is what I'd call that quid pro quo. So they're carving out to say, we're respecting this, but when it falls in this category, Ms. Dockshaw, when you investigate this, you can call it sexual harassment if it's been made a condition of employment, et cetera. So I think it's the state really saying, reverting back to the former standard and carving out that exception. And, you know, obviously from a lawyer's perspective, we're saying, so does this contradict federal law? And so there's lots of discussion here where right now they're saying, no, it provides over and above added protections in this category. So there's not been a conflict of federal and Maryland law that we've seen. Because some attorneys have not modified their regulations. And Michelle and I kind of went back and forth about this. And that's when Michelle said, Jamie, this is kind of the standard that we use. We investigate anyway, and it feels like the right one. So that's why we want to go ahead and put that as a footnote that does govern it. And we think it is keeping to the fidelity of the new Maryland standard. Okay.
Does anyone have any questions?
All right. Thank
Thank you very
you.
much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Michelle. So with that, we can move that on to then work session, you know, contingent on, you know, agenda building as far as that goes. Now, policy 105 is your appeal and hearing procedure. And I will share with you up front that this is a work in progress, and I would like to bring this back to you again because the board counsel, Mr. Nussbaum, who is out this week, he and I are still working up some detail that we'd like to put in here. But because you had some dialogue and you are now using a hearing examiner in an upcoming hearing, I wanted to put it on the agenda so that the public has notification. We're looking at that. We are going to modify that. So the change for now says that you do want to elect your right under the law to use a hearing examiner when you want to use a hearing examiner. What Mr. Nussbaum and I are working on now, we're comparing some other policies in other counties to maybe pull in some detail about what does that look like. Also acknowledging that an individual can still make an argument before the board if they would want to. For example, Baltimore County gives them 15 minutes. Another county gives them 30 minutes. If after it goes to the hearing examiner, I still want to say, board, after you hear the hearing examiner, I still want you to hear my voice. So that is a right under the law. How different counties handle that's a little bit different. So Andy and I are working on that. We'd like to bring that change to you at the next meeting in February. But I at least wanted to, like I said, get it on the agenda because you acknowledge it as a board. This is something that you want to use. And I think it's a great idea.
Yes, I certainly support looking at it again in February. In terms of a couple questions, so I think on page 5, I have in my notes, board pays for the arbiter except in cases where the individual pays 50% of the arbiter. I think that's what I gathered from page 5.
Exactly.
It's a little confusing. Can you explain? So in some cases, the board will fully pay for the arbiter. In other cases, it's split.
If we prevail, if we prevail. And that was carved out in the law, Mr. Bass, because they said for this to be real, a real and meaningful opportunity, if somebody really doesn't want to go to the board, they want to go to arbitration, it is expensive. There is an expense associated with going to that proceeding. And so there was a lot of testimony back and forth about, does this really give somebody a full opportunity if cost would be a barrier? Because they don't have to have union representation. They can represent themselves, but oftentimes the union represents them if they're in that union. And so that was the dialogue to say the board will bear the expense unless we prevail, and then they have to reimburse us 50% of that. And that's very current with how we handle when we go to impasse with the union. So I wasn't surprised when the legislature did some parallel language there.
I think that sounds reasonable. We always get to split the cost of the arbiter if the board prevails.
Correct.
Okay, I think that's reasonable. My second question. Yeah, okay, we added language on the hearing examiner.
Yes.
I want to confirm that if the board wanted to utilize a hearing examiner at this time, that we can with the policy as it has been written.
Yes, because I think somewhere it says you can conduct your hearings in accordance with law. And I think Mr. Nussbaum indicated he had given you that advice in looking at your policy, just because it's not specifically identified. But that's why I did want to go ahead and bring it today to you. And of course, certainly the attorneys that we're working with today and the one that we've notified them and there's been no objection. But I think when now you're going that avenue, you had the legal right to do appeal hearings and that's stated in the policy. But now somebody that wants to know that you're going to that avenue, I think it's really important that they have access to those procedures, which are clearly identified in law, but people look to your policy more so. Although typically when you do go before a hearing examiner, an individual will be represented by counsel. But that's a great question. And I asked Andy that, and he said when he deliberated with you, he did identify that in law.
Two more quick questions. If the board prevails in a hearing with a hearing examiner, does the individual then have to pay 50% of the hearing examiner cost?
That is something I need to look under 6203, and that's what I'm kind of in the midst of doing.
So, I mean, I think in the case of a hearing examiner, though, the hearing examiner is making a recommendation to the board on the basis of the appeal, and then the board is actually issuing the decision. So I don't think there's any opportunity for the board to say, now you pay for the hearing examiner. It was our decision as a board to utilize it, and it's ultimately still our decision on the appeal. So if there's a financial factor in there,
So the stenographic record is the cost. And so if an appellant hears the hearing examiner and they do not prevail and they want to take it to the state board, they have to pay for the cost of the transcription of that whole hearing. So I do know that piece. But as far as the cost that we're using of the hearing examiner, I'm having Michelle look at that. And I think it's maybe identified in Baltimore counties, but that's the kind of the thing Andy and I are working out to give you that detail in your policy.
I would think that would present a potential conflict for us, though, in terms of like how we're ruling in the final decision. If there's that some financial obligation that somebody else.
That's an excellent point.
Because it's still ultimately our decision. We're just going through the whole process and making recommendation to us.
Right,
yeah.
where
At the election of the board.
where the
Yes.
arbiter would be making the decision. The board would not be, okay, right. The hearing
That
examiner
decision
is a
is binding.
facilitator.
Correct.
The arbiter is a decider.
Exactly.
Which is
And-
binding.
okay.
Which is binding, right.
Yes.
The
They know
hearing
that going in.
examiner
Yes.
could recommend either way, and it's still ultimately our decision, but I don't think we want to add a financial
We,
aspect.
that would put the board in a tough spot because
Correct.
we would have a financial incentive
To
to,
bind in
yeah.
our own favor
no,
for the system.
Yeah.
that makes good sense.
Yeah, so Michelle, double check. The only thing that is delineated is the cost of the transcription if that person elects to go to the state board. And typically what we do is we pay it and seek reimbursement because we have to pay the person. Catherine right now is organizing that. We have to pay them outright. They want, paid up front. But then but we have it recorded but not transcribed. And then if it goes to the state board, then they do bear the cost of that because they're electing to go there. We don't need the stenographic record when it's either arbitration that they're appealing or the appeal. The hearing examiner, we will have to transcribe it for the board because they're acting as your agent, and you have a right to see that stenographic record. Mhm.
My last question was on these forms on pages 9 to 14. Are they easily available? Are they online or fillable PDFs that folks can access?
So they are readily available, and now we're working with LP with creating all of our forms as fillable forms. So this one's in the queue. Faye, am I correctly stating that? That LP is working on all of our forms to be fillable forms? So we're in the
process.
queue. And we love that he has the designated, dedicated time to do that. Because we've kind of piecemealed it as they come up, and each time they come up for modification, we do it. But now he can be proactive with all of them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just had one, I know you're still working on the language, but just considering in the language around may have proceedings heard by a hearing examiner, some clarification on how or who determines the hearing examiner, just something about that process.
Okay,
So
sure.
clear. Like in number 2, it says the board president selects the panel members.
Okay.
That's the panel chair. Just something that sort of designates how that hearing examiner is selected.
All right, so that's the detail of the how, and I think Michelle just said that's actually detailed in the statute. So that's what we're doing. Here's what's in the statute. Here's some other counties that have really done this before, and I just want to kind of take the time to look at all that and then bring a strong recommendation to you.
So we can footnote that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now you gave Dr. Lebo homework. Of course, I already knew this was Andy and I's homework. We're working on this. And certainly I'll get Michelle to help me so we can kind of keep this going. Because I do think it's time sensitive. Because I do think we are seeing an increase in appeals before the board. So that way it'll be nice and delineated for you and Ms. Rich and the parties involved.
Just one more question maybe to run by Mr. Newsbaum on this.
Okay.
Because we're responding to the situation by changing the language in our policy, does that in any way jeopardize our decision that our current policy allows us to use a hearing examiner?
No, and that's what Mr. Nussbaum and I had talked about, because we went back and forth, and he said, anything that you would indicate you can do by statute. And the statute does allow.
That was his
all
answer he
boards.
gave to me about that very first line that says, unless otherwise stipulated by law.
Yeah.
He said, that's where it allows us to
Yeah.
go. Yeah. So I just wanted to be able to, if we get that question from the public, to be able to clarify that we're just clarifying language for your benefit.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great question.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So the final one that we have, backed by popular demand, is policy 109. And I will tell you that, Mr. Bass and Ms. Barrett, we were getting close to a good recommendation. So we did indicate that there was some language that we were recommending. And if you look to, I think it's page 5. And so this highlighted area was language that we were toying with as a potential, is this where we want to go to change and modify it? Mr. Bass, would you say that's kind of where we were? Do you want to give a little background?
Oh, I mean, that was the discussion, but I'm not sure. I would not say that the policy committee had consensus on
No, we
changing
definitely
it.
didn't have
But that's-
consensus.
This is where the discussion was in the
Pause.
policy.
Yes, this is where we hit pause. We did not have consensus. And then the board didn't want to take further action on it. And so I'm not sure who requested it. Okay, so Mr. Rose, I didn't know if Ms. Johnson because Ms. Johnson, I think, also said she'd like us to deliberate on it once again.
Multiple members had come to me and asked, would we reconsider this and see if there was a consensus on the policy board to move forward.
And it can be, I like this, I want to modify it, I want to leave it alone. Now you're a new policy committee. And so if you want any additional information or research, you can look at this de novo. Like you want to just put fresh eyes to it, and we'll do any kind of research or information that you need to now deliberate it as a policy committee.
Well, I wanted to reiterate, because I sat in on those meetings, but I want to reiterate that we are the only district that has this language in our ethics policy. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we really never have specifically, because it was so long ago, we've never specifically determined why we added this language, not specifically. We haven't found a specific
No,
case or a
that's-
specific situation to why we added
No,
this
we
language.
did. This was triggered by a current board member applying for a specific position as a staff member while on the board. So no, it was triggered by this happened, and it was, I think, a challenge for the board. And so they said, to avoid this in the future, perhaps we need something that states to remove an appearance or an actual conflict of interest, because we did have someone applying for a job, and it was associated directly in our HR world. And so that does create some awkwardness with staff, because you're screening a board member to determine if you should interview that board member, et cetera. And so you can say, don't treat that board member like a board member, but that was the deliberation and challenge that the board was having among themselves when it was occurring, because staff was seeking direction in that particular case. So it was an isolated case, but it was a case that the board had lots of discussion about, and then guided the ethics panel to look at it, to then make a recommendation to the policy because of it.
And to clarify, that was a staff level position. They were a central office staff level.
It was a central office staff level position, correct?
And so therefore, have there been discussions around this? Have there ever been discussions around this policy in which we would separate out the category in which a retiring or exiting board member?
So I think the
Could be
policy
available.
committee was looking at about, because, and I don't recall who made the argument, but look at it, we're in a teacher shortage. Do we want to carve out an exception when you have a hiring shortage or something like that? Are there barriers or conditions to put around it if they're applying for a job, et cetera? And so we did, and especially coming off COVID and being involved in a real hiring shortage. So we did deliberate as a policy committee about, but what if? What if we draw some really strong, narrowly drawn exceptions? Would the board feel okay then? Remember that, Mr. Reyes?
Yes.
Because that's the question I'm getting from board members and myself, frankly, that this is so broad that a simple example, that let's say in 4 years, I decide I'd like to return to a paid coaching position.
Mm-hmm.
Under this broad perspective here, I could not do that for 1 year.
Correct.
And in essence, as we've discovered, 2 years, because it's 1 year before you can apply. So,
And this was the exception that Ms. Barrett had noted. She said, could we put a note that says, under this category, the board may evaluate exceptions on a case-by-case basis due to a compelling need of the school system, provided A, the exception and rationale are publicly disclosed, and B, concerns of prestige of office or conflict of interest are addressed. So that put the responsibility back on the board to say, do we want to create an exception to our own policy to allow Mr. Rose to apply for a job now? And that would be the criteria. Is it a compelling need, hiring shortage area? And if so, you then put in some hiring barriers relative to applying for the job, and you have to meet all the qualifications, et cetera. So that's the closest we came to brainstorming about exception language. Yeah. The board may evaluate exceptions on a case-by-case basis due to a compelling need of the school system, provided A, the exception and rationale are publicly disclosed, meaning you're saying to the public, we're carving out an exception, and here's why, that we're going to allow Mr. Rose to apply for a job, why he's still a board member. And the concerns of prestige of office or conflict of interest are addressed. And we talked about, if you apply, we're going to take your name off, although still your credentials, people could figure it out. But we got down into problem solving at that level when we were looking at our comfort level with an exception.
would it be appropriate, and it might not be, to say who from the current board was asking for this policy to be looked at again?
Sue has.
Yes, correct, Ms. Johnson. Mhm.
Yeah, my preference is to keep the policy as written. I think 1 year of separation between board service and FCPS employment is appropriate. I think I just feel like I've made these arguments like literally 6 times, right? Like 2 or 3 times at policy committee, 2 or 3 times at board meetings. I mean, we're negotiating the contracts. I never want there to be a conflict of interest where, where negotiations with the unions would be in any way self-serving. And I would never want encouragement of creating new positions to ever be self-serving. It's an interesting data point that we're the only district that does this. But for me, I would say that I would advocate at MAVE, at the Maryland Association of Boards of Education, to say other counties should have this. I think it prevents abuse of power, conflict of interest, and I just have to say I'm uncomfortable with the amount of time that we've spent as a public body discussing this provision of the ethics policy that could only affect 7 people in the whole county at any one time.
I would say the same thing.
Okay.
I find it to be overly broad and excessive. That's clearly my point, is that I believe, because my understanding is are we defining, it says may not be employed by FCPS for at least 1 year following the member's departure. The problem with that is that it hits the timing structure of when interviews occur, say for teaching, bus drivers, custodial, subs.
Right.
So I believe that fixed time period precludes us from, say, someone has already exited the board and they choose to enter the interview process for a teaching position in March that may result in a position in August, but they're excluded.
Correct.
So we're even excluding them from interviewing because our system looks at it like, well, why would we interview you in March? Because you can't start until
A whole another year.
correct. And that's our regulation. Our then interview process for mid-year hires still happens within the 1 year criteria. So I just think it's so simplistic. I find it to be incredibly simplistic, frankly. That when you read most of our policies are so specific and written in legal form. This feels simplistic and broad. And that's my only point, is I believe we could be more specific about, I fully support that we're arguing over something that affects 7 members of our board. But I support being more specific about this and understanding that a member of the board, I would not want a member of the board interviewing for a position within FCPS while still being a member of the board. I don't think there's any argument about that whatsoever.
But once they come off the board, you're saying
Once
why
they come
wait a
off the
year?
board, I just find that to be broad and excessive. I mean,
Yeah, because one could argue you're not really
legally,
using
I
your
find that to be
prestige.
I find it to be not in line with all of our other policies in which they're more thought out, there's more perspective put into them. This feels like this was a thought of passion and emotion at a time when that happened.
Correct.
That's just my point there. And sometimes bad policy is done due to emotion among a board. When in this case, an exiting member, I don't know if they got the job.
They did not.
Okay, so, somebody said, you know what, that's never gonna happen again. Let's just make this so broad, you'll never think about it again.
Well, and my argument at the time was that I didn't think they needed it most counties don't have this language because you have a policy, a very strong policy 109. So in the past, and I'll just give you, Katie Gross was very great about, she'd say, I want an advisory opinion from the ethics panel before I do this. I want some direction before I do this. And she'd go to the ethics panel for everything to get guidance before she would do something. And so right now, let's say this didn't exist and you came to me and you said, I'm going off the board next year. Would it be a conflict of interest or a conflict of policy 109 for me to apply for the job? And I'd say, I guide you to seek an advisory opinion from the ethics panel. Because sometimes the ethics panel would say, well, if it's within 6 months of your departure, now I'm just making this up, 6 months of your departure, do you really have prestige of office if everybody in HR knows you're leaving? I don't know. But I've seen the ethics panel be very thoughtful and deliberative on, are you using your prestige of office? Is it a conflict of interest? We think it would be if it's A. We think it wouldn't be if it's B. And so I think that that is the role of your ethics panel. And that's how I've seen it used before. But you're right, the board felt very strongly and gave direction to the panel about this language. But it doesn't surprise me that this language isn't in other LEAs, because LEAs have said to me, well, Jamie, you don't need it. You already have a process if somebody feels that there's a conflict of interest or they want to seek guidance so they don't walk into a conflict of interest.
That's why I preferably like the language that you're proposing, where it's not saying we're wiping out this language. We're saying there is an avenue for appeal.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. And on a case-by-case basis, where if someone on our board says, you know what, teaching is tough right now. I have teaching experience. I'd love to teach.
Mm-hmm.
The board, instead of the board debating the policy,
Mm-hmm.
the board debates the case.
Mm-hmm.
Fully in front, fully transparent,
Mm-hmm.
and moves forward in that regard.
And part of the option could be that the board is directing the ethics panel to review it and render a decision. Ms. Calendar?
So the area where I'm struggling the most is with having a current board member applying for the position while they're sitting on the board. And even, I mean, I like the language that's being offered. I do think that we could offer some clarity in the policy, but there's still, to me, that prestige of office, the influence of, okay, you can apply, but you're still sitting in that seat. And so maybe you aren't the best candidate, but we still feel the pressure to hire you. And so I wonder if that's something else that if we're considering tweaking the language in any way, maybe it's not, you can't be employed for a year, it's you cannot apply until your term is over, or something along those lines, so that they're not in the seat. And still you could add some of this language around the exception and the word.
So remove the 1 year and just say you can't apply until you are no longer, until your term is over.
That was kind of exactly the language that Sue brought to me, was saying, enable to allow people to apply within that window to
Right.
become teachers in August.
Yeah.
They wouldn't apply until February, March.
Mm-hmm.
Then they're in the interview window
Mm-hmm.
after they've gone through the process of having that
Mm-hmm.
waived.
Right.
Having it approved. So we would basically wipe out the 1 year, but we would say with prior approval. So we wouldn't remove, because any other way, we'd kind of be just removing the entire policy.
Mhm.
If we didn't stipulate that you're going to need approval. So we might still want to leave that language in there that restricts it to a year or whatever we choose, because then what's the point? If we take a year out, we just say, okay, just don't apply. We're kind of removing their incentive to even get our approval.
Mm-hmm.
They would just come off the board. But my other perspective is that, and this has happened, we lose board members to county positions that are of greater stature. And there is no ethical problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of torn on that too,
Mm-hmm.
that I could serve on a liaison committee with the county and work my way into a job with the county and just announce my resignation to take a $150,000 job with the county.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
it all gives me pause for that situation.
That last certainly that last point of it is, I think, really valid, that like, yeah, this is specific to FCPS employment and not other employment. And I'm not sure that we could carve a wider policy than this. I don't know, I mean, I also, so in general, I think we are well served by this policy. I also have some concerns. If we made this change now, it really would feel to me, I don't know if these legal terms apply, but the terms that come to me are like arbitrary and capricious. Maybe I'm misusing those words. When we know that there was a sitting board member who wanted a job with FCPS, and to make this change now, when the policy is written, denied that person the job, oh, it just feels awful. Like, I stand by this policy, but I stand by this policy because I thought this policy would be in place for the foreseeable future. To make this change like right now just actually feels, here's a non-legal term, it feels like a slap in the face to the board member who was looking to work for FCPS.
Well, you have perfect bookends because the change started with a board member and now you're evaluating another change because of a case. And we can't ignore, what do we learn? I always just say, we always debrief in my office. What did we learn? Do we need to now modify that policy, reg, or practice? You're always learning and growing through your experiences, right? But I can definitely appreciate the point that you're making about how does it feel. And so one way it could feel to that person, my situation made them to pause, redeliberate about it because it's that important. So that's the other part of the coin you could look at to say, what did we learn through this? Are we debriefing? Do we want to modify our position because of it?
Yeah, I think I would summarize it in this way. I think we are better served as a Board of Education to definitively say a board member cannot apply for an FCPS job for 1 year after board service. You're right, there's a simplicity to the language that isn't in our other policies, but I think that's a strength. I think we're well served by this current policy. I do not support a change.
When you said the policy, though, you changed the language to may not be employed to may not apply, which is, I don't know if that changes anything, but I don't know. I do support us exploring updating the language, considering some of what you shared and what we talked about this morning to make it maybe more precise and look at whether the employment of a year versus applying outside of the scope of their tenure on the board might make sense.
Yes, I think it's obvious by my question, because I'll add another point. As we're out trying to make this position more accessible to more and more people, I don't think she'd mind me sharing this. Example being, Ms. Johnson chose to take a leave of absence from her position in order to serve as board president and commit the time necessary. If we have, because right now a current teacher cannot serve on the Board of Education. Let's say a current teacher made the decision to resign from their teaching position and run for the Board of Education and was elected. But once they served their term, they were an existing teacher at FCPS, did their duty and served on our board, and would be precluded from being reemployed with FCPS once they finish their term on the Board of Education. I agree with Mr. Bass on that. I don't want to spend months dealing with an issue that affects 7 people, but I do think we deserve an opportunity to look at other options or language or possible waivers around unique situations.
Okay.
So I would support that we charge you with, maybe we can email our concerns to you and you can formulate language that we can then reconsider maybe one more time.
Yeah, we can bring it back. I can draft something based on our conversation.
And maybe we say
we can have
not next meeting, 2 meetings from now, but
March 22nd.
we give it some thought.
Okay.
Would there be value, though, in just bringing it straight to the board? So, all right, two possible things. If the only thing we're modifying is the language highlighted to be closer to what Ms. Barrett had proposed when she was on the policy committee, then I don't know that it needs to come back to policy committee. I mean, maybe
Oh,
at that
that's-
point it would go to work session.
If you're okay with moving that language over to a full board discussion and vote.
I don't like
I'm
like
not
that we're.
steamrolling, yeah, I don't wanna.
Oh, but I don't think a further discussion at policy committee is going to change my mind or your mind. So
Right.
let's not belabor it. And yet, there's another part of this ethics policy that I want to raise that might cause us to want to bring it back. In terms of the financial disclosures, that's the part that I personally find so onerous. I find filling out this form to be complex, time consuming, and we want to make sure there's no major, issues, conflicts of interest. But I don't know, I think this form is unnecessarily complex. And I wonder if it drives people, if it limits the pool of folks who are willing to run for Board of Ed. Because it's so specific even on what, that candidates have to fill out the very same form. I guess a question is whether members of the House of Delegates or County Council have to fill out exactly the same
They
form.
do, David, and so we don't have the legal authority to change it. It is by statute that we have to follow the same form the delegates have to follow. So anybody that works in state government, delegation, that's how this was all driven. Here's their model form. Now, local government, you have to mirror it. And the State Ethics Commission has to oversee it, see it, and bless it. So I will share with you, I absolutely agree. I worry that it would create a barrier. You are sharing a lot of information, and that is a public document. I definitely feel that. We just recently met with the ethics panel to review it, and we had to legally say we reviewed everyone's form. We do back and forth with you if you've missed something. And so I worry too that it was a barrier because it's very comprehensive and it is a lot of information, but it is legally required and you would not have the legal authority to modify that part of the policy. Sorry.
That's pretty clear.
Sorry, and I agree, but that's pretty clear.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we don't have a chance to modify that language in any way, I would support. It said, I've made clear I don't want to change the policy, but if, I don't think there's reason for it to come back to policy committee. I think with the change described, to me, it should go to work session.
Can you reread that one more
Yes.
time?
The board may evaluate exceptions on a case-by-case basis due to a compelling need of the school system, provided A, the exception and rationale are publicly disclosed, and concerns of prestige of office or conflict of interest are addressed. And what I can do is modify it and send it to the committee. You could say, hey, I want to tweak it or I want to add. So you don't have to say, that's the language. That's where we deliberated before. But I can send that language to all three of you and you can, of course, we know David's not going to do anything, but the two of you, and that's okay. I respect the consistency of your position. David, you and I have journeyed a long time with this.
We
So
sure have.
Longer than we should.
That's.
But let's do
I
that.
think so.
If
Okay.
you do that, it's not gonna get on the work session right away. anyway.
No.
So let's do
no,
that.
and like I said, because what we've been told is to really be mindful of the board's priority with your agenda on budget right now.
Yeah.
So, okay, I can do that. All right. So our next meeting is February 22nd. And like I said, I'll coordinate a draft agenda with you prior to that. As far as what we'll have on the agenda, we do have policy 443. We had some input from students that they wish the policy committee to consider with some clarification about use of bathrooms on policy 443. So I'll be bringing that, not with a recommendation, but for you to look at the input from students to determine if that's a change that you want to advance. So that was one policy that we have that's coming. And then political activity, another real easy one, that the board asked us to look at as a policy committee after the election, because we had some just clarifying questions and issues around that. So we'll just have some deliberations on that one as well.
I think that, Wednesdays, 9:30 and all of this, I think it makes good sense for our policy committee meetings. I guess the one thing I'm thinking about is, will there be significant interest in public comment on some of those things, and whether it's hard, right? Like, I think a consistent time, and Wednesdays, 9:30, second board meeting of the month, right? That's our policy committee time, but whether we should have any consideration of a time that's easier for folks to make public comments. I'm torn on that.
Good point.
Well, and that is the beauty of that anything that you do has a first and second reading with the board at the work session. And then it goes on the evening consent, which can be pulled off or receive public comments. So this journey's in a morning, then an afternoon, then in the evening. And just like today, I think two people are seeing that. And I think it is good to read the public comment into the record. Because I think sometimes when you jockey around the change, sometimes we hear from the community, just kind of keep it consistent. We kind of know it, and we know that how we can get comment to you, because you're much more accessible now in the wonderful world of technology and email and having that board president account. But oftentimes, just like today, that public comment came in, it was read into the record. And so that's feedback. Sometimes if we'd say, well, wait a minute, why is it 11:30 today when it's always 9:30? So I do think consistency is important, but also we have pulled, like policy 117 is a perfect example. We knew and we wanted to create multiple opportunities to ensure voices were heard and people had multiple opportunities to participate.
Is that in the Find Out First? When Find Out First goes and notifies the public this meeting is set for,
Yes.
is it in there that public comment is welcome, and any public comment submitted by email will be read into the record?
No, but I think we could add that.
Because I think that would be,
Catherine, yeah, we could
Okay.
confer
I
with
think that would be
Catherine.
good for the public to know that if they can't make it, that it's going to actually be read.
Okay, can you follow up with Catherine?
Okay.
All right, well, that was productive.
Yes.
Well, well done, Madam Chair.
Yes.
All right, well, we'll make sure we do our homework for you, and we'll be ready for the next part of what we want to do next. Thank you very much.